started with this evening's talk. We're very excited about this evening. And so I need to tell you a little bit about the rules of the game as far as the Zoom webinar is concerned. Basically, in a webinar format, none of us can hear you or see you. And so we rely on the Q&A feature, which you should see on your screen, for you to submit questions. We're going to have it set up so that after his initial talk, there'll be plenty of opportunities for him to field questions from you. So as you're listening, please don't hesitate to go on ahead and submit those to us. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Brian Williams, who is going to be introducing Joe Smarro. And Brian Williams is no stranger to the University of Georgia. He is now an associate professor at the University of Virginia, but previously was with the University of Georgia. He's the author of Citizen Perspectives on Community Policing, a case study on Athens. And more importantly, he is committed to public engagement. So he spends a good bit of his time working with a variety of folks in the community, including police departments, to help them kind of forge out productive paths ahead. And so it's with great pleasure that I'm introducing to you, Brian Williams.
Thank you so very much. Good evening to each of you. It is indeed an honor, my pleasure, and a privilege to introduce to some and present to others During his 11 years working on the mental health unit, he has dealt with some of the most severe cases of individuals suffering from a mental health crisis. And in doing so, he saved countless lives. He is featured in the award-winning HBO documentary, Ernie and Joe, Crisis Cops, that was shown in 2019. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our speaker, Joe Smarro. Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I want to call you doctor, but you asked for me not to do that. So anyway, it is a great, great honor for me to be here this evening with you all in Athens, Georgia, wherever you are watching. I know they shared the link with some other areas, and I know Brian was just mentioning some folks in Virginia as well. So a huge thank you to the University of Georgia for hosting this event, for seeing the significance and the timeliness of it. And when I was asked to do this, of course, I jumped at it. And when we were talking about a working title, for me, it was what really, what captures my career in law enforcement. And it really has been this idea of introducing humanity into everything we do in policing. And when I was talking to some people about it, it was like, are you reintroducing or introducing? And I think that's a potential debate question, but I do think that, again, there are incredible efforts happening right now. I think the communities have spoken, and there's definitely a better way that we can do things. And so I'm happy to be here. When I was speaking with Susan earlier, she was talking to me about the fact that there's a 30% increase in admissions at the University of Georgia for the criminal justice program, which I think is phenomenal. I think it's really a testament that people are, with everything happening right now, people are willing to come forward and step up, or at least learn about it from another perspective. And either one, I want to join it and be a part of it and be an influencer and be on the positive side of this. Or two, maybe I don't want to, become a career law enforcement professional, but I definitely want to learn about it. And so hats off to both groups of people that are just curious, which I think is the antithesis to any bit of judgment is curiosity. So, and she also shared that the majority are women, which I think is fantastic, because I remember I was doing a talk several years ago, and people were asking about potential changes that could or needed to be made, or something that I would like to see happen. And this was probably 5-6 years ago, but I remember saying, I think we absolutely need to have more women in positions of leadership within law enforcement. And I don't just say that from this idea that, well, naturally, maybe women have more empathy, maybe they're more patient, maybe they're better listeners. It really is about this idea of, capturing the essence of having a more whole police department that represents the communities that they serve, right? And so I also think when it comes to positions of leadership, specifically, we need more women, and we need more minorities in the profession of policing in America. So again, I welcome everyone that is in any of those groups. And I'll just start with this, because I'm very grateful that the students that are attending submitted some questions beforehand. And a few days ago, I was provided these questions just to kind of, sit with, and I was thinking about them. Some of them were questions I've been asked in the past. Some of them were new to me. And so, again, I love the level of engagement, and I hate apologizing for anything up front, but to kind of piggyback on just the wonkiness of what is now 2021, but with everything being virtual, it's hard, because I would love to see everyone that is attending. I would love to be able to look at everyone and just actually be in person and engage and interact. And I go a lot off of energy and kind of fuel the room and feed off of that. But we're going to make do. But I love quotes, and I'm going to start this off with Socrates' quote, which, I love this idea. And for anyone that is thinking of going into teaching or education or whatever, it's a great quote to also let yourself off the hook a little bit. And so I travel around the country and provide training to various groups about law enforcement, principally as our premier clients. And I always tell them, like Socrates says, I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. And so I might not, over the next 30 minutes to 60 minutes, my goal is not to teach anyone anything. My goal truly is to maybe create some varied perspective. Maybe it's to create a little shift, and maybe you see something differently, or you hear something that resonates within you. But I'm going to come back to that quite a bit, because I really believe that the greatest thing that we can do for anybody, for humanity, for this country, for your community, your town, your city, the greatest thing that any of us can do is fully get to know ourselves. And again, I'm going to keep pointing back to that, but I think that there's so few of us in the world, and I'm not saying I'm one of them just yet, but there are so few in the world who actually, truly, genuinely know themselves. That truly know themselves. We know our titles, we know our achievements, we know our positions, we know our things. But if you stripped all of that away, who are you? And I don't think we spend enough time in self-reflection. So I'm going to jump in. I kind of frame these questions out, but the first thing is, there was a group of students asking about careers in law enforcement. So you're in school and you're contemplating potentially joining a police department, a sheriff's office, but some level or capacity of law enforcement in this country. And again, we absolutely need men and women to do this job and to do it well. So if you are considering a career in policing, and I pause because I really think we need to get away from the term law enforcement. And I say that because I think there's certain laws that are meant to be broken. And if you have seen the documentary, if you have watched it, and sadly on my end, I don't know if it did for everyone else, but when Brian was doing the intro, it kind of froze on my end. And so real quick backstory on this, and I'll bring it back around to the careers, but and how certain laws are meant to be broken. Because if you're a young student considering a career in policing, you might have been like appalled by that statement, but hang with me. Certain laws are meant to be broken. But I'm originally from upstate New York, born and raised there. Horrible childhood. If you're familiar with the ACEs assessment, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, it's one of the courses that I teach in our 40-hour CIT school. It's one of the most profound, powerful courses that I teach. But I talk about the amount of trauma and suffering and abuse I had as a child, starting at 7 years old, from sexual molestation of my mother's boyfriend while she was married to my father, and then the physical abuse and the neglect and just the horrific upbringing that no child should endure. And I left home at 15, started couch surfing with friends, and my girlfriend, my high school girlfriend at the time, I was in athletics and she was a cheerleader, and her parents knew that some stuff was going on at home for me. And so they kind of took me in and they brought me under their wing. And, you know, the only best way I knew how to thank them was by getting their daughter pregnant, our senior year of high school. And that's where you would all laugh and be like, my goodness, yeah, no, it's ridiculous. But I was a misguided child. And one of the things that I always point back to is it's not that I never knew, or I'm sorry, it's not that I did not know right from wrong. I had such an apathy towards all things in life. And this is what so many people in our country are suffering through right now, are kids that are coming up in broken homes and abusive homes and homes with substance use and serious mental illnesses. There's such a level of neglect. And so then what happens? And for me, sadly, I had a child my senior year of high school, which I wanted to go to college and play soccer. And so that didn't happen. Obviously, I joined the military. I joined the Marine Corps because they promised me the world. And I found myself deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. I did 2 tours overseas. I was in Iraq when the war started in 2003. And it was something that, you know, it really continued while I grew up super fast. It absolutely devastated me because I was never meant in my mind. I was never this gung-ho, hoorah, go get 'em type person. I just wanted to go to school and play soccer. And yet here I find myself in Iraq in firefights. And the first time I actually had to experience death and witness death and be a part of that, I knew I don't want this. And so then I got out after 4 years of honorable service. And then I moved to South Texas and I found myself joining a police department. Why? Because I was 22. I didn't have a college degree. My only skill set was survivability and a couple of combat tours. And so what was I going to do? And to me, my first job was a security job. And the guy was like, hey, you should join the police department. Okay. And that's what I did. And it took me a good 7 years before I started going to college for the first time. I'm happy to say that I graduated. And I actually have 5 classes left for my master's degree. So I am chipping away at it, but it's been a rough struggle, all because of understanding now what those ACEs attributed to my life and the very difficult choices that I've made. Now, why do I say certain laws are meant to be broken? How's that come full circle? One of the things that made me, I would say, unique in this career, and that's according to a lot of my peers, was the fact that I always chose to see people over their problems. Always. I never cared why I was called to a scene or to someone's home or to a situation, no matter what it was. I never got focused or hung up on the problem nature of that call. I would always focus on the person first. And my mantra in policing was always person over problem, connection over correction. And if you think about it through that lens, it's like, what's the goal here? The goal ultimately is, safety. We want to manipulate or get some type of behavioral change. We want to de-escalate situations for sure. But you're not going to do any of that if you don't have some level of connection, if you don't have rapport established, if you don't have trust established. And I also have a firm belief that if you're an adult, especially living in this country with a serious mental illness, you've probably had a negative interaction at some point in your life with a law enforcement officer. And so it was always my task to show up and make sure every single call, they were going to think of me as the greatest thing that blessed their lives, because I would make it absolutely impossible for you to be mad at me while I was at work. All right. I do get off duty and I'm human too, but while I was working, it was like, I'm going to make it like, no matter what you say to me, no matter what you do to me, I am not going to punish you or take it out on you, because I have a very, very general understanding that, well, several things, but one, the ancestor to every behavior is a belief, and people's behaviors are always communicating a higher need. And so when I say certain laws are meant to be broken, think about someone who has a serious mental illness. Let's say they have schizophrenia. They're addicted to some substance. Let's go with meth. And this is very, very common, especially in San Antonio. I don't know what the major problem is there in your area, but I can tell you in San Antonio, we have a serious mental illness issue coupled with these comorbidity, co-occurring disorders. Methamphetamine is rampant. And so if you have somebody who is unfunded, they don't have insurance, they don't have stable housing, they don't have any house, they're homeless, they have schizophrenia, and they have a meth addiction, do we not expect that they're going to be walking in the roadway or flying a sign, as they say, panhandling, or maybe sleeping or sitting on a stoop of a business at 7 a.m.? There's laws against those things, but we cannot criminalize behavior. We can't do it. We've seen it. It's failed. The war on drugs. So many people in prisons right now for drugs, because we saw drugs as a criminal issue instead of a behavioral issue. And people who have addiction problems should not be incarcerated because of their addiction. They should be treated. And the same to be said for people who are homeless, the same to be said for people who have a serious mental illness. We cannot incarcerate away from a problem. We cannot do it. We have to be willing to face it. Always realize that people are people, and people are going to do people things, which means everything, right? No two things are similar. And so if you are considering a career in law enforcement, hats off to you. What I would say is stay the course. I love the fact that you are first getting college educated. It puts you one step up, because a lot of police departments in this country have almost a zero minimum requirement. You can get in with a GED. You don't even have to have a high school diploma, and you have to be 21 years old and, a very, very okay background history. And, they're even allowing things like, one-time cocaine use and different things. And so we've really loosened up the standards to get in, because while I'm happy to say or hear that 30% of your admissions have increased, the overall numbers of recruiting and policing in America have gone down pretty significantly over the last 5 to 10 years. There's just less and less people wanting to do this type of work. And so, again, I would say, and the specific question was, what can I do as a student to become better equipped to serve the specific population of mental illness and substance? Learn about it, because this is why it's super important. If you're not familiar with ACEs, look into it. But if you have had a really, really good or decent life, good. If you have a 2-parent home, if you had food all the time, if your lights were always on, if you had, spending money, if you had a home and a car and like life was good, you never faced any level of abuse or trauma growing up, great. But please understand that a lot of the calls that you're going to be responding to are absolutely chaotic. They're complex. You might be dealing with people who have violent tendencies or maybe have an addiction, a history of substance use, or have a mental illness, or like there's so many complex needs that law enforcement has become the de facto, police officers have become the de facto responders to all things. And so while it's super unfair and unreasonable to expect that we're going to have, all of these hats on and be able to effectively do all things really, really well, because the reality too is like, it's almost a zero mistake game. It's like a pilot, right? Pilots are not allowed to make mistakes. You make one mistake one time and crash and it's done, right? And it's kind of the same thing in this profession. If you make one really, really poor choice, that could be it. And, not just for you, but for your family, your department could really take a hit. I mean, it really has a significant impact. And so there's really high stakes. And so I love the fact that you're first learning about these things, but understand too that theories are one thing, life experience is a whole other thing. And so when you can have a combination of both learned experience coupled with lived experience, and you're willing to share those, because the greatest teacher in life is life, right? And so if you have the wisdom you've gained over doing things in life, use that. And I never was afraid of my story, because stories unite us, stories connect people. And so if I would show up on a call and I could connect with someone or relate to something that we're going through and they were open to it or willing to listen, we would just talk. And because something that people need, all people, right? Regardless of who you are, where you come from, whatever, but something we all need is that level of like relatedness and fairness. And, there has to be some level of trust to build dialogue and build rapport, especially if you're talking about, I'm trying to get someone to do something with me. So, next question, what should police departments be looking for CIT to be effective in their agencies? One, understand first, CIT is not new. The crisis intervention training has been around since an incident happened in Memphis, Tennessee in 1987. And then the University of Tennessee or Memphis and NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the police department came together and they created the old Memphis model of crisis intervention training. It's great. It's not new. I love that it exists. It's a 40-hour model, but what I don't love, and the Memphis model of CIT knows this because I say it everywhere I go, their model suggests that only 10 to 20% of every police agency should go through the training, should go through the 40 hours of CIT training, and it's voluntary only. And I wholeheartedly disagree with this. I think CIT training should be 100% mandatory for all officers. You should not have a choice. And my argument to this is until or unless, as a police officer in this country, when you get dispatched to a call and they call your number and they say, okay, go make this location for this call, until you can say, yeah, no, thanks. I don't like that one. Give me another one. I'll take the next one. Next. We don't have a next button. You go where you're told to go. And so why do we get to pick and choose our qualification, right? Why do we get to pick and choose and say like, no, I don't want to have a basic level of understanding mental illness. I don't want to have a basic level of understanding like how to interact with people or to be a better communicator, because that's really what a good CIT program is. And also what I'll say is, because there's nothing standardized, policing in America is highly decentralized. Nothing is standardized. And so even that 40-hour CIT is so like just vastly different if you go from city to city, state to state. Like people just do their own thing. I've seen CIT programs where they have one person who works in a jail who's never been on patrol just read through 40 hours of PowerPoint. 5 days, 8 hours, just reading PowerPoint slides. Zero experience, has never been on a mental health call in the field, no role plays. I mean, that is disaster, because what's sad is now the department can say, box check, they've got CIT training. We train our department, they got CIT. But there's zero buy-in. There's zero behavior change. There's zero cultural shift, which is the single most important thing, in my opinion, is we have got to shift culture of policing in America. And so one of the ways that we can do that, and we've proved it. I actually started, and this isn't a selfish or selfless plug here, but I started a company in 2017. This is all I do now. I left the department in September of 2020, just 4 or 5 months ago. And all I'm doing full time now is training. And I go around and I train police departments in CIT, but I use CIT as a vehicle. So they get credit for the CIT training, but so much of our training is focused on officer wellness. So much of it is on self-care. So much of it is on creating this introspection of how can I better understand myself and why I do the things I do, because I really believe that it's an inside job. And if we're ever going to move the needle, we have to first be willing to do it within ourselves, because I think a whole officer, a better officer, a mentally well officer makes for a better family, meaning his or her family, which makes for a better police department or sheriff's office, which makes for a better community. And I think when we're trying to force it the other way around, so much of police training historically, so much of police training is, we're going to prepare you to better serve the community. We're going to teach you this to better serve the community. We're going to teach you this for the community. And it's like, well, what about me? Like, at what point do you teach me something about vicarious trauma? or self-care or my own mental health and wellness? Like, at what point are we going to prioritize the fact that there was a great longitudinal study done out of Columbia from Dr. John Mann, and they found that over the course of a 20-year career, on average, police officers respond to 188 traumatic events. 188 traumatic events in a 20-year career. And we know most cops do more than 20 years. They do 25 or 30 or more. And so if on average we're responding to 188 traumatic events, then when do we start learning about us? And where's the support come from? And so I use CIT strategically just to get into the department, to be like, oh yeah, we'll do CIT training for sure. And we do. And it's great. I say it's the best in the country because the experience we bring, me and my partner. But so many of those classes are focused on how can we create a better you, individual. Start with me. It has to start with me. All right. And we talk a lot about projection and neuroscience and just basic psychology and human behavior and why we do the things we do. And so, but we make it fun as well. In every good CIT program I've seen has always been officer-led, community-supported. I was in Greensboro, North Carolina, 3 weeks ago, and they have a statewide initiative. It's broken up by regions, but so much of theirs is really community-led. And it's hard to get officer buy-in when you have a community-led program like that, because right away they're challenging credentials, credibility. We're like, who are you? You don't get it. You haven't seen it from our side. You haven't responded to these calls like we have. And there's a lot of resistance. And so it's important that you have officers within each agency that are willing to be champions to start, again, moving that needle, ultimately addressing the culture. There was an ask about, as far as students right now and citizens, like, what can we do to help? And while that's a relatively broad question, what I would assume it means is specific to policing in America and kind of just the problems that we've been seeing. But I think, one, keep doing what you're doing, because it's obvious that now more than ever, police departments are kind of under a microscope. And I think that comes from citizen pressure. If you're not doing anything, then get involved, right? Like, look around. If you're in school, go to your local departments, ask them what their training requirements are. What does their police academies look like? How much of that training? I was in Shreveport, Louisiana, just last week. Their training academy is 596 hours. 596 hours of their basic training. 8 hours were spent on mental health of 596. And I asked the officers, I said, what percentage of your calls or time, or how many mental health calls do you get a day? And all of them, oh man, forget it. I mean, we're doing at least 2 to 4 a day. They said they handled on average about 12 to 15 calls per officer per day. And they said about 2 to 4 per day were mental health. Yet, whatever 8 of 596 is, I imagine it's a very small fraction. That's the percentage of training they're getting to focus on that thing. It's absolutely absurd that we have not focused from that level of, oh, if we want a different outcome, we're going to have to show up and do things a little differently. And if we want to show up and do things a little differently, then we're going to have to look at where it all begins. Because here's another belief I have that isn't super popular on the world of policing, but when I was fortunate enough in 2019, when the film came, before it released on HBO, we were doing like a film festival tour. And this was pre-COVID, and we were watching them in theaters and bringing communities together. It was fantastic for conversation. And one of the questions I got asked most was, hey, Joe, okay, this is fantastic. So if you were in charge for a day, like, what would you like to see happen? And I was like, oh, I love this question. But while there's many, many things specific to policing, I think the first thing, raise the age. Like, your brain is, as a man, your brain is not even fully developed till 26. Your prefrontal cortex isn't developed till you're 26. Why are we giving you a gun and the ultimate power? I don't understand it. And so here's what I said. If you don't want to wait till 26, because I know there are some great men and women that are 21 to 26 that are absolutely qualified to do this job. But I still believe this. If you aren't going to be 26, you have to have a 4-year college degree. And after your 4-year college degree, you have to have at least 1 year of working in some form of social services. Because my belief is you've got to learn to have compassion and empathy and serving people and kind of meeting them where they are before you have the power to remove their civil liberties. And people love that, but it's like, well, why haven't we done it? I have no idea. I mean, I guess because the people who actually make decisions haven't asked me. I don't know. But I think like how much would change? Look at if there was some study to be done about what percentage of not just officer involved shootings, but use of force incidents come from officers with less than 5 years on that are that age of 21 to 26, 27. Like, of all your use of force, of all your officer involved shootings, of all the things that are happening, what percentage are in that first 5 years? And I think if we just slow down a little bit and we allowed people to show up to this profession with a little bit more wisdom, a little bit more education, a little bit more patience and empathy, maybe we could get some pretty significant changes and outcomes. Another thing too is, what are we training in the police academy? So this was a whole revamp, right? I think not just raise the age and the standards, but how do we recruit? It's gotten a lot better. I've seen videos, but typically a law enforcement recruitment video is high speed, rock and roll, people rappelling out of helicopters, dogs jumping over walls and fences, SWAT teams in a stick, breaching a door, doing all this really, really cool high-speed stuff that 99% of you will never do. And I think we have done a terrible disservice of creating this idea of policing looks this way, and it draws in a certain type of person that's like, ooh, I want to go do that high-speed stuff. I want to go chase and run and get into vehicle pursuits and all this stuff. But then you realize that there's all these policies that kind of go against it. And the first time you do it, it's not fun. And you could get hurt, and you could get complained on, and you could get suspended, and you could hurt someone else. And like, who enjoys that? And I remember I had this epiphany after I had about 2 years on patrol and was in a foot chase. We caught the guy, it's like they run from you, they passively resist or violently resist. And I remember after that was over, I clear as day, I remember thinking like, in what world did it become okay where I thought this was fun, or people were like celebrating, like we're hunting people? Like we just, this bad guy ran, and we chased him, we caught him, and we jacked him up, and we got him, like, oh man, and we're high-fiving him. Like, what is happening? Like, that goes against everything that I am. And like, no wonder this is all uncomfortable to me. And like, no wonder I didn't like love the celebration in Iraq when I was in firefights or having to like take another human life, even though they're firing back at you. And it's like, that's an identified enemy. And still, it was a terrible, terrible thing to experience. Yet it was celebrated by other Marines. In police department, like it's the same thing. We get into these things and it's like you build your reputation or status on like, oh, you're a go-getter, because that means you're out there like mixing it up and all these things. And it's like, if we could just pause. And I always pose this question to officers when I'm doing a talk or training or whatever. And I say, if you were to think back, whether it was 1 year, 5 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it was, if you think back to the day you got your letter, your phone call, your email, however you were notified that you were going to start the police training academy on Monday or of this date or whatever it was, there's not one of you that got that letter and was like, damn. This really makes me mad. I don't want to do this. So this is terrible. Like, I am so mad about this. Like, this is horrible. And you were frustrated by it. That never happened, right? You were so excited because what you told the panel or the interview or the people that you wanted to do that job for was all for the right reasons. And I believe it. And I believe all those right reasons were there. And then you go into a training environment where there's so much pressure. And I like to say things that are a little bit, unconventional or maybe offensive to some, but I always tell people there's like a 55-gallon drum of paranoia in every police academy, and they just draw up these like syringes and just inject you. And it's like so much fear-based training. Fear, 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 fear. You're going to die. You're going to die. And it's like, well, the numbers of 2019, I'll do the updated ones going forward. But for 2019, what I know is that 48 officers were killed in line of duty. 48 were killed in line of duty, 44 by a handgun, 239 killed themselves. So like, what's the real problem, right? What's the real problem? And I think those are questions that we have to be willing to answer and ask within policing. Most important challenges, and I'm going to start wrapping soon because I really want to get to some questions if any have come up, but I'll end with this one and then I'll transition back to Brian. But what are the most important challenges facing police officers and police leadership? And I always go back, culture, culture, culture. All right. Culture is it. We are so stuck. And I believe, based on what I've seen in all my traveling and my experience, is that typically police departments, not all, again, nothing is a one, right? In social science, nothing is a one. There's always outliers, but I believe that a majority for sure of police departments in this country are about a decade behind the communities they serve. And why I believe this happens is because if you think about a police department, and I use San Antonio as an example, how it works here is you graduate the academy. It's 7.5 months long. It's one of the longest, most arduous police academies in the country. We don't take any laterals. You have to go through our training academy if you want to go, if you want to be a San Antonio police officer. 7.5 months. So you finish that, you're in a year of probation. After that, you're just working patrol. No ifs, ands, or buts. You're going to go to patrol. Before you can promote, you got to have 5 years on. No prerequisite. No, it doesn't matter. No college degree, no leadership experience. You could have had 3 suspensions. As long as you're still actively employed, you just have to take the test, and the top test taker gets the promotion. Same thing with sergeant, same thing with lieutenant, same thing with a captain. They start doing video assessments. But there's no like context of who you are as a person, as a leader. It's just take this test and then you promote, take this test and you promote. And I think that what happens is we get people that have been doing the job a long time, and then they maybe go off patrol, they go to a specialized unit, and then they go back to the training academy. Now they have 15, 20 years on. Immediately, because the brain craves familiarity, we go back to what we know. And it's like, I'm going to run the academy the way it was when I went through. And we've all heard these stories. If you're in policing, you know, like, they have it easy now. Back when I went through, we had to do this and this and this. I had to walk there and back in the snow. It was uphill both ways. And it's always like worse back in the day. And we all think that way. And so now I'm the academy director. I'm going to make some changes. I'm going to revert back to the way it was 15, 20, 25 years ago. And it really does make it difficult to kind of progress and move things forward. So that coupled with, again, so much emphasis on the fear-based tactics side of things, of the real quick last story, and this one like breaks my heart, but one of my buddies was saying, you know, hey, and this was in San Antonio, but he said, we were getting a report writing class. This is just a class on how to write a police report. And he said, to start that class, the instructor pulled up a video, and it was an officer getting ambushed and shot in the face and killed. And he was like, what does this have to do with report writing? But there's so much of that, like just propaganda, right? Just thrown at you of this job is dangerous. And while I will agree that this job can be dangerous, so can every job, right? And if 44 out of the 900,000 police officers in this country, if 44 were shot and killed by a gun, it really is so superficial and odds. And I know those are all people and names, and it's terrible for sure, but so is the 239 suicides. And I think we have to be willing to do very unconventional things, like from the top down and from the bottom up, self-advocate, champion, mental health, self-care for myself, and then the ripple effect is beautiful. So, Brian, I yield to you. I'm sorry I went a little bit over, man. I just talked too much.
No, thank you so very much, Joe. I'd like to open it up with a question before I turn it over to Susan for other questions. Joe, what do you see as a way forward for officers who are serving and protecting during the pandemic in conjunction with this period of police protest?
I think one, I think patience is huge. I think as far as a way forward, I think like any crisis, right? I mean, I don't want to like minimize what's happening, because I know, especially if you're directly involved, and I think of the officers at the Capitol and, you know, just everything that's been happening. But you could say the last year, the last 2 years, and there's some people that are like the last forever. There's always been some level of strife if we know the history of policing in this country. But I think what we know is like a crisis is like a season. And if we just wait long enough, it'll change. Now, it doesn't always change for the better. Sometimes, summer or fall turns into the winter, right? But we know it'll change. And I think if we're willing to stay open, I tell people, the heart and mind is like a parachute. And every day you're jumping out of a plane. When you leave your house, that's your sanctuary. And when you leave your front door, you're jumping out of a plane. And your heart and your mind is like a parachute. And if it's closed, it's going to be a rough day. You're not going to bounce. If it's open, if you stay open to ideas, to people. And I think the other thing too, Brian, specific to that, is a way forward is be willing to listen. Patience and be willing to listen, not just see it as an opposing side. Like if, the sociologists have these in groups and out groups, and it's like, if you don't look like me, think like me, talk like me, then you're in the out group. And if you're in the out group, then inherently you're a threat. And we have to be willing to break those walls down and say, I really want to listen to get to a place of possibly understanding where you're coming from. Like, I'm curious about your perspective because I can't imagine what it would be like for you because I'm on this side of it. And I think just being willing to listen to people, allow them to share their story, acknowledge that this is the whole trauma-informed. Trauma-informed care and policing is the universal precaution. Every time EMS shows up on a call, they wear gloves because the universal precaution is someone has a communicable disease. The universal precaution in policing needs to be every single call, somebody has a history of trauma. And if that's true, how can I show up different for them or better for them? And if they've had a negative interaction with policing in the past, how can I make sure that this one's positive? Even if I show up and the first thing out of their mouth is slurs or curse words or hate or whatever it is, instead of hearing the words, I hear the pain. And getting past the words. The words are fluff. Words are 7% of the pie. It's the other 93% that make up communication. And so it's like, hey, if you tell me, screw you, I hate you, get out of here, all these things, I don't hear those words. I hear pain. I hear fear. I hear other things that are, again, communicating a higher need. And so it's like, how can I be patient and inject some empathy so that maybe I can allow them to see me as a human, but also ensure them that I see them as a human.
So we've had a few questions that have come up about CIT training, and in Georgia, I suspect, like a lot of states, it's a little variable depending upon the jurisdiction that you're in. And at least one of the summary observations that came up were, what is your thinking on how early can it, should this be offered, given, frankly, limitations on resources, I'm thinking too, to police right upon graduation from the academy, and assuming that they're also getting something in the academy.
Yeah. So again, our academy here gets the full 40 hours. And, here's what's important to understand. CIT, crisis intervention team, crisis intervention training. There's so many people who are on opposite sides of all the things, right? Also, I think we need to get away from being hung up on the words and just understand that you need training. And so, because one of the issues that we had with the documentary, even with CIT International, was they struggled to support it because they were like, wow, it goes against the way we think that CIT should be implemented. The fact that you guys train CIT to your cadets, they didn't really want to support the documentary because of that. And it's like, look, here's how we run it in San Antonio and in Texas. Every cadet gets the 40-hour CIT training. After that, because we have different levels of licensure, right? So you graduate as a basic, and then you get an intermediate, advanced, and then the master peace officer license. And so what Texas did is, after the Sandra Bland incident, they created this the Sandra Bland Act, where now if you want to go from basic to intermediate or intermediate to advanced, you have to take this 40 hours of, again, they call it CIT. It's not. It's their version of the number is 1850. And so that is essentially 40 more hours of CIT training. So all of them are going to come through it again. And so our officers get a lot of it because it is a priority from the top down. We've trained 100% of the department in CIT. The cadets get it. And then after they graduate, usually in about 2 years, they get the 1850 version, which is just another version of CIT. It's a lot of overlap. It's a lot of the same thing. But But so, yeah, I think it should be in the academy. Don't call it CIT if it's offensive to some. Just call it mental health training or call it effective communication training. The bottom line is we have to change those like scales, because I really believe that so much of the police training academy should be on basic, psychology, understanding human behavior, being a master communicator, being a really, really effective listener, understanding all of those nuances, because that's 99% of what we do day in and day out is show up and talk to people, right? And so why it's not prioritized, I never really understood.
Thanks, Joe, for answering that question. So the next question we have was submitted by somebody who is a police historian focused on transforming police education in their home state of Virginia. And so the question is, in your experience, what role can police historical education play in transforming police training and police community relations in our country?
That's a beautiful question. So, wow, I didn't even know that existed. So that's super cool. But two, I would say take whatever. I mean, obviously, if that's your wheelhouse, take that information and I would go approach the police department with it. I can already in my mind see that being a class in a training academy or at an in-service. We have annual in-service training. Every year we have to do 40 hours. That's the best place to capture everybody. It is time consuming because you're looking at every week, but that's a beautiful thing that you could do virtually. You could show up in person, but I think it's important. And I was hearing this the other day, and it's not that I didn't know it, but just being reminded of it really was kind of startling. And it was for the people that come to this country but are not citizens, to take that citizens test to become a United States citizen. They have to take a test, right? And I think it was like 88% or whatever of natural born citizens in America couldn't pass the test. And I think it's a sad reality that so many people do not fully understand our history. Documentaries have done a decent job. There's a lot of available information out there, but you have to be willing to go find it, right? And so I really believe, again, just you saying that, I was like, oh, wow, that would be really cool. There was a guy I met here locally. He made terrible choices, was in prison for many years, but he got educated when he was in prison. Now he comes out and he goes around speaking to police departments about what he calls urban culture. And it was brilliant. And so we brought him out to our academy to talk to the cadets too, to say, hey, look, you have to understand, if you didn't grow up in the hood, as he said, like what experience do you have? Or like, because you might just see somebody, like, for example, it was like, hey, if you see, a black guy with his pants sagging down, immediately you're profiling. You already have something in your mind about what possibly could be happening, or you're forming a judgment or a stereotype or something. But he went on to explain it again, providing that historical context, providing this idea of if you take any community, you're going to have the quote unquote hood or marginalized community or underserved community. And then you're going to have the affluent area. In the affluent area, you don't have, the same amount of like pawn shops and liquor stores and things like that you do in the marginalized, oppressed parts of the community. And so kids grow up in that environment knowing that's all it is. That's just part of language. It's part of culture. And so I think understanding history is super important. And I would have not have said that probably 2 years ago. So I think, like create a 1-hour class about the history of policing in America, why it started, our original functions. And it's like, no wonder there's still strife all these decades later, right? And I think if you could condense something like that to make it like engaging, maybe a little fun because it is a police group, but providing those and start out with a pop quiz too. I think that would be brilliant because everyone would fail it, including myself, sadly. But I think it would be a fun way to, again, we have to fully, or as much as possible, really get to a place of understanding where we come from and how we ended up where we are. Because again, nothing's by accident, right?
So our next question is from a recent grad, just looking for advice on what you would offer to someone who is looking at civilian positions in policing.
All right, I'm going to shoot you straight. So if you want to do it, that's great because they exist and we need them. But again, my experience largely comes from where I'm at. it is not even fair or reasonable because the civilian positions in policing don't get paid nearly the same as the actual police officers. So if that matters to you, and again, I guess there's different levels because we do have like a civilian like XO on our department. That's like the equivalent of a deputy chief. I imagine he does well, but most of our civilian positions, and I'm not sure specifically what you're talking about, people that work at the substations, answering phones, giving reports, like a lot of administrative type work. It's great because support's needed, but it really would be about like, what do you specifically want to do? Dispatching is a very, very difficult job because again, just understanding that's still trauma accumulation and you don't really get to see it. And again, the brain hearing things sometimes is worse than the brain seeing things. And so as a dispatcher, you're sending officers all day long to these situations that you really never get closure on. And so there's a lot of trauma consumption there as well. So I would say it just depends on specifically what your niche is that you're looking to do as far as being a support person for law enforcement.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have is, what do you think about taking advantage of being a campus police department and trying to recruit new employees from areas like education majors, social work majors, along with the traditional criminal justice department?
And they're a campus police officer?
I'm not sure if this person is or isn't, but yeah. I'm
okay.
not sure.
Then maybe I might, sorry, Delaney, I might have missed the first part then. I thought I heard you say something about campus policing.
Yeah, so the first part of it was, what do you think about taking advantage of being a campus police department?
Got it.
If I had to guess, I would probably say, yeah, it's a campus police officer.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great. Cherry pick from other professions for sure, because I think it's, I think some of the best things are when they're a little bit unconventional, maybe a little unpredictable. And so you would assume like, oh, you're a criminal justice major. Like, what are you going to do? I'm going to go be a police officer. Like, oh, shocking. But when you can get someone that, and there's only a handful that I know of, again, a lot of officers, our department's big. I mean, 2,400 officers, and I know a lot of them. And so when you talk to them and know their story, it's like, for so many, it was so predictable. It was like, this is something they always wanted to do. This was like, oh, I knew since I was 7 and I first put on a traffic vest, and it's like, oh, geez. But what about the people who maybe can bring in a fresh perspective? What about, and this is my problem with those recruiting videos as well, is I think we're targeting a very specific type of person. And maybe we can broaden that scope up to get people who are like, I don't know, they have a degree in economics. And could we bring them in to be police officers? Absolutely. I really think that there's going to be, in some places, maybe there already is, but I think in the near future, I think there's going to be a big push to get people with social work backgrounds into law enforcement, into policing. I think there's going to be a lot of cross training. The more co-responder models you're seeing, there's a lot of police agencies that are going to these co-responder models where you have a behavioral health clinician paired up with an officer responding to these calls. And so I think there's going to be a lot of that where there's going to be a marriage between, or a blend of, officers getting cross-trained in some level of social work, and then social work, getting trained in some level of policing. And I think it's smart too, because typically social workers really are people-centric and they want to help systems become better to serve people. And again, it's like that it's an interesting relationship, because then you have law enforcement, again, stereotypically, that's like, I want to go fight crime. I want to, put the bad guys in jail and protect good people and all this. And it's like right away, we have this divide in our mind of good and bad and right and wrong. And I would say campus police is fantastic. Some schools are going away from school policing because of all the things. And so they don't want uniformed officers in schools anymore, sadly, because I think, again, kids are so impressionable. And so seeing a uniformed officer, having a friendly interaction, having those conversations, I think it is valuable. But on a campus level, again, it's like, how personable are you? There's some that just kind of hang around and like, please don't look at me, don't talk to me. And then there's some that are super engaged and like love talking to the students. And so, I think that's a great form of recruiting, taking people out of their comfort zone.
I think we got the questions from the Q&A, but I had kind of a follow-up question because a lot of what you've talked about is dealing with mentally ill populations. And I think a person's own stress probably is less if they are effective in dealing with those populations. But are there also kind of strategies that, whether they're in law enforcement or people working in other aspects of the criminal justice system, to help manage that stress? I mean, we hear a lot, I'm just giving an example, people that use regular physical exercise, but are there kind of other things that you would suggest people to do, kind of to help, at least the students are getting ready? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a great question, Susan. And so before I left, I had to teach it in service. We were doing our mental health refresher, which is it's CIT update, really. So it's an 8-hour every 3 years we have to provide it. And because Texas had not updated any of the material in probably 11 years, it was the same thing. And because we have to do it every 3 years, it was like, this is our 4th iteration of this same stuff. And so I said, hey, would you mind if I carved out 90 minutes to create this self-care class? Using, again, serving on the mental health unit for over a decade, the amount of officers that I had to help, the amount of like things that I learned along the way of that, coupled with my own stuff, right? Because I go to therapy every month. I think it's one of the things that I tried to push before I left was mandatory mental health appointments. And I think that it should be a national mandate. I think that officers should have to go at least one time a year, at least, while on duty. It's nothing they have to do in their own time. But I think while on duty for one 55-minute session, it's paid for by the city or the community. And because here's what I learned in that class, and it was called 6 Pillars of Self-Care. And it was a 90-minute block. And I taught it from January to March. Then we shut down for COVID. There was no training for 13 weeks. And then when we came back, I did it from the beginning of, or the end of June until September. So in those 5-6 months that I did it, I was able to plug in 24 officers for the first time in their lives into therapy or some level of services from that one class. And they would come up to me right after and say, hey, Joe, you just made 30 years of my career make sense, man. Like, I've been terrified to retire. I need help. Or, hey, I'm drinking 25 beers every single day. Like, no doubt I'm showing up to work drunk. I need help. Or, hey, I'm addicted to pornography and I have all these like buffering things that I'm doing and avoiding, and I'm emotionally detached from my kids and my family. And it was so rewarding for me to get these officers plugged into services. And so here's what I learned. 2 things need to happen for a lot of police officers to be willing to come forward to get help until we shift the culture. One is opportunity, and the other one is a willingness. So willingness alone isn't enough. If I'm just willing, I don't know. Like, I might be willing, but if I don't know where to go for help, if I don't trust the system, if I think the chief's going to find out about it, if there's no confidence, I'm not sure, I'm not going to do it. So willingness alone is not enough, because we have 3 full-time department psychologists for the officers. We have we have a lot of resources here in our community as the 7th largest city, specific for first responders. We're Military City, USA. There's a lot of places that cater to us for our own mental health. And yet, because they're not right in front of them in that moment, they don't take it. And so because I was up there teaching that class, they felt that connection to come forward. And because I shared my story and all that, they were willing to come forward and be like, oh, wow. Like, if Joe can stand up there and talk about therapy and the fact that he does all this, like, and it's okay, he still works on the department. Like, clearly the department supports him. He hasn't gotten in trouble for any of this. Like, oh, and they were willing to do it. And so I think that's so globally mandate mental health appointments. But on a very low end, if that's not going to happen, because here's what I tell officers too, is if you're waiting for your department, your community, or whatever to come save you, it's probably not happening. You have to be willing to do it yourself. We have to be willing to champion for ourselves. And so, in that class, which is 90 minutes, but there's like psychological self-care, personal self-care, professional self-care, spiritual self-care. And I go through and explain these different levels of like what you can do. But yeah, very basic stuff. I think it all starts with sleep. Understanding a lot of law enforcement officers in the country are sleep deprived. Shift work is brutal. We were never meant to stay awake through the night. So sleep is where a lot of things should start. A decent diet, because we struggle there as well. Stable relationships, again, having social support, making friends with people who are not police officers, and expanding your in-group, because so many officers, they out of comfort, fear, whatever it is, they have a very small group of friends. And I tell them, like, if I were to ask each one of you to name your top 5 friends, and if you said to me, 1, I don't have 5 friends because I don't like people, that's a problem. Or 2, my 5 friends are these people that work on my shift with me, that's a problem. Like, we have to be willing to go make friends with people that don't think like us and act like us. And it really does kind of open us up to the world around us. And so I think, just for tangible little things we can do, therapy is always huge. Volunteer for a cause, and don't say because you're a police officer or first responder, like, well, I'm in a service-oriented business. Like, yeah, and you get paid for it, right? So what do you do in your time off? Because you can get an incredible dopamine hit from volunteering and selflessly serving other people. And so for me, it's therapy. I start every day with a gratitude journal. I volunteer and serve other things and help other people in various capacities. Mindfulness meditation are great things that you can do as well. And then just get outside and be active, a 20-minute walk a day. Even, like, it doesn't have to be anything rigorous. I'm by no means in incredible shape, but I do play golf a lot. And so, yeah, just a walk. Getting outside it's super, super basic stuff, but being intentional. And then again, the journal is great for self-reflection too, because we spend so much of our time avoiding feelings.
Cool. Thank you for all of those points there. So another question we have is, how would you describe the difference in a race problem and a culture problem?
That's difficult. I don't know. Again, I don't want to be ignorant. I can, it's hard. I don't want to answer that from like a myopic lens, but I only know what I know. Just because I'm educated on some other area or topic, to me, I really think it matters that we, like, culture is created by, groups of people around us. Race is what it is. And I don't want to be confrontational. And I know when we talk about this stuff, and there's a lot of ideas and opinions and all these things, but I've met a lot of police officers in my 15 years of doing this and traveling around the country. And in like training environments, in outside work environments, and all these things. And in that time, and I don't know if we're talking specifically about like racism or just race, but I have met one police officer that was like, oh, wow, like, dang, that is a problem. But that's out of a ton. And that's an issue, to be sure. And I don't want to discard it by any means. And I'm sure that there are some, I'm sure they exist. But I think beyond that, it really comes down to fear. I think everything stems from that. And I was corrected. And I think it's okay to own our mistakes. And I used to tell people, and it was on one of these panels actually for the movie. And I said, because they asked specifically about race. And I said, look, I learned long time ago to become colorblind. Like, I don't see color. I just see people. Like, I really do focus on people. And then I met this great, great man who was also in a documentary, the St. Louis Superman, Bruce Franks, and he's out of Missouri. And he, this guy, it was a beautiful, beautiful story, because he did this story on like growing up in the streets and protesting, and, with the Ferguson killing and all these things. And then he went and became a state representative and was like suited, but he has tattoos on his face and all this stuff. And before we were going to meet him in DC, the filmmaker was like, hey, I want you to watch his is a short documentary. And I was like, I'll be honest, like, owning my stuff, I was like, he's an activist. He hates cops. Like, why am I having to watch this? And we were going to share a stage in DC. And I thought the whole film was going to be about him, like, slewing insults and hating police officers. And we get on stage, we're on the panel. I met him before, we're talking, and we get up there in front of a live audience. And he goes, and I didn't tell him that story, by the way. And he goes, my filmmaker sends me their documentary. And he goes, I remember thinking, like, what is wrong with you? Like, why are you going to send me this documentary about these 2 white cops from Texas? Like, I'm not watching that. And I looked over at him and I was like, I had that same exact experience. And it was this beautiful moment. It was one of my favorite things that happened on that whole tour of traveling around the country doing this thing, because we both owned the fact that like we had these ideas, these judgments, these whatevers. But what does it all stem from? It stems from fear. It's not, like, again, it's this idea of like, oh, I'm not going to be liked, or I'm not going to be seen, or I'm not going to be valued, or I'm not going to be understood, or I'm not going to be loved, or like, it really is simply boiled down to that. And when I told him about the colorblind thing, he said, no, like, I don't want you to ever say that again. He goes, I want you to see my color. And I was like, oh, okay, touche. But I think this is an important piece too. We have to be open to education. And that means being educated by other people. Remember, perspectives, right? So for him to say, no, don't say you're colorblind, because then that dismisses who we are. I want you to see my color. And I was like, wow, man, okay, right on, man. Like I'm teachable. And I heard that advice several years ago from a speaker. And he said, one of the best life lessons he has for anyone is to remain teachable. And so, but because so many people are afraid to have these conversations, when it comes to race, we're like, oh, hot stove. Like, I don't know how to, like, I don't want to be offensive. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want, like, if your intentions are to learn, don't be afraid. We have to be willing to have these difficult conversations. And so, like, again, culture, race, like, I don't know. I mean, race is something that's like given without choice. I think culture is created. And so, yeah, they have to be, you can't do anything about one of them. And then there's culture, right? So I don't know. I don't know if I answered that question well or not, Delaney.
So if you have time for one more question, we actually had a question from someone. So in Athens, Clarke County, they have 2 co-responder teams that are up and running. So what advice do you have for teams that are up and running?
Yeah, learn from each other, cross-train. The clinicians need to be part of the fabric of the police unit. This is why we were in Greensboro. They were starting a brand new behavioral health team, and they have CIT already, but they say, well, we want you guys to come in and give us like your version of the training. But it was like 9 police officers that were going to be the behavioral health team. And I think there was 9 clinicians or 10 with their supervisor. And then they had their hostage negotiation or crisis negotiation team there as well. But seeing that blend of the clinicians and the officers working together in this training, and then giving them all these insights, because we have 3 clinicians on our team. And when we would have a training day, they would come. When we would go like do anything, they would come. Off-duty stuff, they would come. I mean, they became part of the team. But it's important that we learn from each other, because again, we're coming from a different set of like, there's like a different historical context here. And so our unit became as successful as it was because when we first started, we were attached to the local mental health authority, and we went out on every single call that the clinicians got from the mobile crisis outreach team, MCOT, and we would just observe. We were there for safety, but we were just observing. And I remember they would have a checklist, and they have their clipboard, and they'd show up and be like, all right, hey, Delaney, so what's your name, your birthday? Okay. When's the last time you went to the doctor? Do you have a diagnosis? Do you see any shadows? What medic? And I'm like, what the? So we would learn, like, why do you ask those questions? Like, oh, it's part of this assessment. I was like, oh. I said, well, it's super impersonal. Like, it's like a checklist. Like, I wouldn't want to answer any of those to you. And so we learned all of the questions to ask in an assessment, but make it into conversation. And then we, started to spread. So now we didn't show up on every call with a clinician because our team worked differently. We weren't a true co-responder model. I think it's important to have basic level of training on tactics for the clinicians, because again, they are clinicians. They have not probably been trained in crisis management, in safety and awareness, environmental safety, understanding your surroundings, understanding about like those like pre-assaultive movements, very simple things that need to be taught. But that's the biggest thing. If you're in a car together all day making these calls, and there's so many different ways, this is like a CIT thing. Co-responders, we just say like, oh, it's a clinician and a cop, and they go do that. But like, there's so many different ways to run this, because even Shreveport does it like so different than the way ours runs here. Houston has a traditional co-responder model, runs so different so people just come up with their own way of doing things. And so what I would say is, as much as possible, have the clinicians' schedules match the two officers' schedules so they're always together, and it's a team. Because what they were doing in Greensboro is the clinicians had to have 24/7 coverage, but the officers, the behavioral health team didn't. And so there was like this weird overlay and gap, and they were never going to like work together in the same time on different days. And it was wonky, but they're just starting, and at least they're starting. And so they're open to suggestions and feedback as well, which is great. Stay teachable. But that would be my best advice: is learn from each other, stay open, cross-train, make sure that you're teaching them on basic tactics and environmental awareness stuff. And then just figure out your flow. It just comes with time. I think the best way to learn and get better is through saturation. And so the more you do it, the better you get at it, the more you can start to really understand people and connect with people, and should have incredible success. So congrats, Athens, for your co-responder team. I love it.
Well, I think we're wrapped up then. We kept you a little bit past, but so I really appreciate your staying on.
No worries.
And hopefully did I miss anything? I think we're good. Okay. So I want to say on behalf of everyone who can't say anything out loud, thank you very much, Joe Smarro, for being with us and sharing your insights. It's been invaluable. It really has been. I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. Delaney, great job. And Brian, man, it's both times have been incredible seeing you. So thank you. I hope we can stay in touch, because I'd love to hear about what you're doing. I think it's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.